Good morning. I want to invite you this morning to turn with me, if you would, to 3 John. 3 John is where we're going to be reading from today. I've appreciated the way you've worshiped. I trust the Lord has heard our voices as we just sang. He's done great things indeed for us, both as a people and as individuals. And just appreciate how you've lifted your voice to say that to Him in the way that you've worshiped today. I want to read from 3 John, and this entire letter, if you'll follow along with me there, beginning in verse 1 of 3 John. John writes, "The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. For I was very glad when brethren came and bore witness to your truth, that is, how you're walking in truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. Beloved, you're acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brethren, and especially when they're strangers. And they bear witness to your love before the church, and you will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. For they went out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore we ought to support such men, that we may be fellow workers with the truth. I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be the first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words, and not satisfied with this, neither does he himself receive the brethren, and he forbids those who desire to do so, and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does good is of God. The one who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our witness is true. I had many things to write to you, but I'm not willing to write them to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and shall speak face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends by name." Isn't that a great letter? I don't know who Gaius is. There are several Gaiuses that are mentioned in the New Testament. There's a Gaius that's in Corinth. There's a Gaius that accompanied Paul on his missionary journeys. It's mentioned in his third journey, who was mentioned as being from Macedonia when Paul writes of him. And I don't know if John is writing to that Gaius or one of those Gaiuses or to someone completely different. But he writes this encouraging missive to Gaius and encourages him because he's just heard a positive report about him, gives him a warning about a man named Diotrephes and an encouragement about a man named Demetrius. And though it's a short letter and a personal letter, there are some abiding truths for us to glean from what Paul writes in this, or what rather John writes in this third letter that is attributed to him in the letter of 3 John. So I want to contemplate for just a little bit this morning some standards to live by that John introduces us to in this letter that he writes to Gaius. The first of these standards I want to note is found in verse 1 and actually throughout the letter, but especially in just the way that John addresses himself to Gaius. He says, "The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth." I just have respect for the fact that John is old. And he calls himself the elder. And I expect not just because he's older than Gaius, but because he's just old. He's been ministering, he's been serving for a long time. And he's not stopped serving. So that he hears an encouraging word about a man named Gaius from some brothers that have recently stayed with him. And he takes the time to sit down with pen and papyrus and write a letter to Gaius to encourage him. And the abiding truth that I want us to observe from that action and from other actions that are intimated in the letter is this: servants never quit. Servants never quit. They never stop serving. They never stop doing. They don't stop when they're old. They don't stop when they're tired. They don't stop when they prosper. They don't stop when they're burdened. And we see the picture of all of that in the writing of this letter. John is old, but he hasn't quit. In fact, it seems that John didn't write any letters until he was old. I don't know what he did before then, but I know he was working. I know he was serving. And now that he's grown old, the writings of John, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and the Gospel of John and Revelation were all safe for his latter years. But he's still serving. He's not retired. He's not stopping in his service. And I know John had to be tired. And I know he had to be burdened by the fact that his friends that had followed Jesus along with him, they're gone. If not all of them are gone, they are one by one disappearing. They're going the way of James, and they're going the way of Peter, and they're going the way of Paul. They're all going to martyrdom, and John is left, but he doesn't quit. And as he writes to Gaius, he speaks some good wishes to Gaius in verse 2, where he says, "Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers." I appreciate the fact that he prays, that he wishes upon Gaius prosperity, but I want you to see how prosperity is second to his spiritual well-being. We're going to say more about that in a moment. And Gaius has demonstrated that kind of spiritual wellness because he's been busy too in service. So look at what he says next in verse 3. "For I was very glad when brethren came and bore witness to your truth. That is how you're walking in truth." Look at verse 5. Behold, beloved, rather you are acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brethren, and especially when they're strangers, and they bear witness to your love before the church." Gaius has been a servant. And whether Gaius was prospering or not prospering, I just appreciate the fact that Gaius shared that with John, that he was a servant. Sometimes people quit serving because they prosper. I mean, when things are well, then they neglect their spirituality. Things are going well with your job. Things are going well with your health. And so you just, you don't mind God because there's no pressing problem. There's no burden that's brought you to your knees, that appeals to you to come back to Him. When you prosper, don't stop serving. Don't stop ministering. Don't stop working in the kingdom. But not only can prosperity be something that causes people to quit, but burdens too. And John writes about some of his burdens in this letter as he writes about the problem with Diotrephes. That could be a discouragement. Confrontation, or somebody not receiving your admonition. He wrote something he said to the church, and he says Diotrephes has opposed him. And sometimes people quit because somebody opposes them, or somebody doesn't receive them, or because they get discouraged when the things that they try to do to help don't work out or aren't received well. Don't quit. Servants, don't quit. Did you hear that? Don't quit. The Lord is worthy of our. The Lord is worthy of better service from us than us quitting because we're tired, or quitting because we're discouraged, or quitting because we prosper. Servants never quit. And John is a model of that kind of behavior. The second thing that I want you to note comes directly from verse 2, where John says this to Gaius. He says, "Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers." The abiding principle, the standard to live by that I want you to see in verse 2 is this: the measure of a man is the state of his soul. The measure of a man is the state of his soul. How well you are has everything to do with how your soul is. It has nothing to do with how your health is. I mean, true wellness has nothing to do with that. True wellness doesn't have anything to do with your prosperity, what your bank account looks like. It doesn't have anything to do with how many friends you have or don't have. It is not the measure of how much talent or giftedness is yours. The wellness of a man, the measure of a man, is the state of his soul. Now, I love how optimistic that truth is, because it says that the possibility of wellness, of real soundness, of real well-being is within all of our reach. Because it doesn't depend on our talent. It doesn't depend on our wealth. It doesn't depend on our popularity. It doesn't depend on what country we live in. It doesn't depend on what circumstance we were born into. It has nothing to do with things that are external. Our true wellness has to do with our relationship with God. And so that John, as he writes to Gaius, says, I pray that the other external things in your life, like your health, might be as good as your soul is. He says, I pray that your health prospers the way that your soul prospers. Because he knows that Gaius' soul is in a good situation. He knows that his soul is well, and so he prays that everything else can be as well about Gaius as he is on the inside. Now, take that measure, that standard, and apply it to yourself very, very personally. If your physical physique right now was a reflection on what directly reflected the wellness of your soul, what would you look like? I mean, would you be on oxygen? Would you be in a wheelchair? Would you be confined? Would you be a shut-in? Or would you be a Popeye? I mean, would you be a Mr. Universe? If your physical well-being or stature were a reflection of the wellness of your soul, maybe we could be blessed by that. If there was some kind of way in which our body reflected the wellness of our soul, but that's not the way it is it? And as a consequence, when how we fare and how we feel can so often be a measure of physically how things are in our life. But that is such a deception. That is such a lie. And Satan deceives us when we buy into that untruth, that falsehood. I mean, when things are well with your soul, then things are well. Amen. Things are well. Things are good when things are well with your soul. And if we could find in that and remember in that the blessedness that we really have in Jesus, when we have Him, we are rich. Amen. When we have Him, we are well. When we have Him, everything is good. Blessedness is the abiding state of those who find themselves in Christ, and blessedness is the best. It's the best, and it's not restricted to our physical circumstance at all. It all comes from the fact that things are well with our soul. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? The only thing that you and I have that's of any real worth is our soul. That is it. And when our soul is secure, then everything is good. And when our soul is not secure, then everything is bad. The measure of a man is the state of his soul. Number 3. Look, if you would, at verses 3 and 4. When John writes about the things that he rejoices over as he writes to Gaius, he says, I was very glad when brethren came and bore witness to your truth. That is, how you're walking in truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in truth. Could I say to you that here's a standard to live by, an abiding truth that John writes about in this letter that's found in those two verses, and that truth is this: our highs and our lows are tied to our treasures. Our highs and our lows are tied to our treasures. And when John writes about what makes him very glad, and when John writes about how he has no greater joy than this, he's talking about things that he treasures here. He treasures the fact that Gaius has been found to be walking in the truth, because that's where he's invested himself. He's invested himself in God's truth. Not just in knowing that truth and believing that truth, but in walking in it and living it. And so it makes him so happy. It makes him so glad. When people come and when they tell him, when they spread a little good gossip about Gaius, about how he's someone that's walking in truth. And he says, there's nothing that gives me greater joy than to hear about my children. And who are children? They are who you invest your leadership in, right? I mean, whether they are from your household or they're your children by faith, as I expect that Gaius is in this instance, John has invested in him. He's invested his leadership. He's invested his love. He's invested his care. And he sees how that's bearing fruit in Gaius' life. And because he treasures that kind of person and that kind of life, then he is high. He is emotionally, he rejoices over the news of that. I'm excited because yesterday we, for the first time, put both of our cars in the garage. We've been in our house for a couple of years now, and this is the first time in Chelsea Park that we have put both the cars in the garage. Now that may not mean anything to you, but it means something to me and Jennifer, because we invested a lot of hours making that happen. I mean, we threw stuff away. We put stuff up in the attic. We did it yesterday when we were sweating, going up and down the stairs, putting things in the attic and getting it out of the garage, which just means that one day we're going to be trying to do something about that, instead of doing something about the garage. But when you invest in something, and when something good happens as a result of the investment, you feel something about that, right? And when you invest in something and it tanks, if next week I won't be able to get the Pilot in the garage, I'm going to feel lousy about that because I invested something in making it happen. Now, how do you feel today? Are you high or are you low? How did you feel this week? Was it high or was it low? And I expect that for all of us, it's always the case that where we are, what we feel, has something to do with where our treasures are, right? And I'm not saying by that there's not times that that we are immune to being down or immune to being sad, or that we shouldn't rejoice with those that rejoice over little things. But what I am saying is that our real and abiding joy has this underlying faith perspective. That when we are invested in the kingdom, when we are plugged into a relationship with God, when we are busy in expending ourselves in things that have to do with kingdom and with people that have to do with kingdom and with sharing our faith and with shining God's light, when we are in those things, then there's an abiding joy that is not subject to the ups and downs of the stock market or to who's the next president. I'm so tired of thinking about that. This world is not our home. This is not our kingdom. And thank God for that. Our highs and our lows are tied to our treasure. Where is your treasure? What do you really love today? You're going to demonstrate that by the topics of your conversation, the things that you read, the things that you think about, the things that you dream about. And if your dreams are all tied to things that are here, It doesn't take much for those dreams to tank. It doesn't take much for them to go away. But when our dreams are tied to things that are eternal, when that's where our source of life and our source of happiness and our source of hope, that is abiding. That is lasting. And if that's not where your dreams are today, I just want to urge you to get a better dream. Find and fill your life with God. And not with things that are here. John says to Gaius in verses 5 and following, as he writes about his recent encounter with some brethren that came to visit him. He says, verse 6, he says, they bear witness to your love before the church, and you will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. For they went out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support such men, that we may be fellow workers with the truth. One abiding truth, a standard to live by, that I want to point out in 3 John is this. Hospitality is a sign of a healthy heart. And it is the simplest way to make a difference. This letter seems to have been prompted just because John hears about how Gaius has been hospitable to some brethren. And that may not sound like it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that Gaius opened his home and cared for these men who were out for the sake of the name. These men who went out without the support of he says, of the Gentiles, and they've come through Gaius' neighborhood, and Gaius has welcomed them into his home. He's fed them and he's cared for them, and what rich conversations they must have had around the fireplace or around the oil lamp. As he broke bread with them, and as they slept in his home, and they've warmed themselves in the hospitality and the compassion of this man, and John is impressed with that, so much so that he writes a letter to Gaius to tell him about that. Hospitality is an easy way. It is a great way. And it's so countercultural, because everybody's busy with ball. And everybody's busy with work. And everybody's busy with all the stuff that we're busy with. And so when we open our home, and when we share our table, and when we share our home with those that are pilgrims together with us, that's meaningful. It builds ties and bonds that are strong and that are rich. It helps to fortify our unity as a people. It gives occasion for us to say words that are timely words, to admonish or to edify or to exhort or to build up. It gives us a way to look into one another's heart and to know each other better, and ways in which we can minister and care. Hospitality is such an easy way to share our faith. When you get people around your table, then it just brings down so many walls and so many barriers, and they can see your kids, and they can see your wife, and they can see what kind of marriage you have. They can see what's on your bookshelf. That they can see so many things about who you are in those kinds of encounters. So many admonitions given in the New Testament about this practice, this habit. Practice hospitality ungrudgingly to one another. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 9 says, which says that if you invite them over and they don't invite you over, don't get bent out of shape about that. You just practice hospitality. Not so it can be returned, but because that's just what believers do. You do it ungrudgingly, Peter says. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels without knowing it. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 9, a widow is to be honored if she's shown hospitality. Practice hospitality, Paul says to the Romans, Romans 12 and verse 13. Bishops are given to hospitality, 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. Hospitality is how Jesus sorts the sheep and the goats in Matthew chapter 25. the feeding those that are hungry, and the clothing those that are naked, and the giving a cup of cold water, the visiting those that are in prison, all those are acts of hospitality. They are acts of service. And Jesus says, when you do it for them, you do it for me. The sons of this age, Jesus says in Luke chapter 16, are wiser than the sons of light, and how they use material things to make friends. Luke chapter 16. Jesus taught a whole parable where he talks about how the unjust steward who took his master's things when he was being put out of his job, and he forgave all of their debts. And the point that he's making there is that this man used material things in order to build his relationships with the sons of this age. And he says sometimes we ought to learn some things from folks at the bar. Sometimes we could learn some things from folks that are tailgating. Sometimes we can learn some things from the sons of this age who use things that are no good except in this world that's rusting and that's moth-eaten. They use the things of this world to build relationships and God's people. The sons of light ought to know that all this stuff that's passing away, the only thing it's good for is for sharing. The only thing it's really good for is for building meaningful ties to others. So that when we get to the big home, the big house that God has reserved for us in eternity, we'll have hearts that are tied together because of the experiences that we've made with one another here. Gaius understood that truth. Hospitality is a sign of a healthy heart, and it's the simplest way to make a difference. How's your heart when it comes to that? I mean, how healthy are you in that regard? How much of a difference are you making? With that simple act, it's powerful. And Gaius is a demonstration of that. Finally, could I say this to you? It's exhibited in verse 10. It's exhibited again at the end of this epistle. Look at verses 9 and 10 where John writes this about Diotrephes. He says, I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be the first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words. And then in verse 13, John says to Gaius, he says, I had many things to write to you, but I'm not willing to write them to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Could I say to you that here's the common denominator in what he says about Diotrephes and what he says directly to Gaius? There is no substitute for face to face. There's no substitute for it. When you have good things to say, there is no substitute for face-to-face. And when you have hard things to say, there is no substitute for face-to-face. And even Diotrephes deserves the respect of being spoken to face-to-face when there's a problem. And I just appreciate about John that he is not telling Gaius about Diotrephes so that he can put it in Gaius's lap. He's not saying, I want you to go deal with this fella. He says, he's warning Gaius about him, but he says, when I come, I'll handle it. I'll talk to Gaius. He's not asking, I'll talk to Diotrephes. He's not asking Gaius to do it for him. He's going to do it himself because Diotrephes deserves that kind of respect. Our relationships are such that they merit face-to-face. If somebody wants to be first among us, we need to confront one another about that. If somebody's hurting other people the way Diotrephes was hurting the people of God, it's my duty as your brother to talk to you about that. Or to speak face-to-face about such things. And not just when there needs to be a confrontation, but even when there's encouraging things to say. John says, I've got so many things that I want to say to you, Gaius, but they deserve me saying them to you face to face. I'm not going to put them down with pen and ink. And so John is not going to be tight-lipped about his encouragement any more than he is about talking about when things are wrong, when things are not good. Our relationships are such that they merit that kind of candidness, that kind of care, that kind of love. Because the ties that we have, that exist among us, are blood-bought. I mean, Jesus has purchased us with His blood. We are family. And so we show each other the care, and we show each other the respect of talking to each other face to face. And it's the best way to stronger ties and to stronger relationship. It is never easy. And I don't ever know a time where it's not messy. I slobber all over the place when I try to confront, and I stutter all over myself when I try to encourage. But people see when you stutter. See, I can't even talk to you and not stutter. People see when you stutter that you're looking for the right word. You want to say it carefully. And when you slobber, when you sputter, when you can't find the words, when you're nervous, then they appreciate that too, because it shows that you really care and that this matters. And so whether it's something that needs to be said that's difficult, or whether it's something that needs to be said that gives someone a foot lift. Brother Jones back in Houston, Texas, used to say to me when we talk, he would talk about if he was encouraged by somebody about them giving him a foot lift. And he was a big man, and so it took a big foot lift to help him along. But I love that expression. And so whether it's something that's in confrontation or whether it's something that's a foot lift, when you say it face to face, there is no substitute for that. Well, isn't there a lot in 3 John? I mean, there's a lot that John had to say to Gaius. And they are things that are worth our meditation. They're things that are worth not just our meditation, they're worth our imitation. They're standards to live by, standards for us to follow. There is no substitute for face to face. Are you ready for face-to-face with God? Are you ready for the inevitable interview when we'll stand before His judgment seat and when we will answer for how we've lived in the body? Are you ready to meet Him? Are you ready for judgment? Are you ready for eternity? If you're not this morning, then consider the fact that the only thing that you have that's of real value is your soul. And won't you make that secure? Won't you be washed in the blood of Jesus, the blood of the Lamb, if you've not been this morning? Won't you put Him on in baptism? Won't you turn back to Him if you've wandered away as a child of God and come home if such is your need, and we can help you? Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?